This video is all about the role of the Pope, the Magisterium, and the Second Vatican Council. So if at any point you're having a bit of trouble sleeping, then you might want to watch this video because, let's be frank and honest, these are not the most interesting topics on the course, but there's a very sort of strong chance that you will be asked on one of these three topics. So if it comes to the role of the Pope, okay, you might have to describe or explain sort of what he does. Well, the first thing you say is that he's the leader of the church, okay? And it'd be really good if you link that to apostolic succession, how Jesus appointed Peter, and the power and authority that he gave to Peter is passed on to today's Pope. Also, you say that he is responsible for the Magisterium, or for all church teaching. The reason for this is, once again, is that, well, there's a need for it. We need to be sort of directed in today's world, but you can also say about that's essentially the role of a leader, to communicate the message. So therefore you could link that to the fact that, like, he's called the Supreme Pontiff, or you could talk about the way he spreads the message through, like, encyclical letters or something like that, okay? Or just he goes out and teaches sometimes. One of the things that the Pope does, he travels around the world to unite Catholics, all right? So to help them understand that that Catholicism truly is Catholic, universal. Another thing that he does is that he meets with world leaders. I mean, if he was on Instagram, then he'd have 1 billion followers, all right, the Pope, because that's how many Catholics there are out there. So he's a very important person. So he meets with world leaders to ensure that their views are sort of represented. So, I mean, Donald Trump and Theresa May and those sort of people, those characters, and he would meet with them to give them sort of advice on things. He also works alongside he works with his bishops, you could say, right? He works with his bishops to sort of give them direction about how to lead the church within their diocese. Again, that's the sort of letters and that sort of thing, and it helps to pass that message down. It filters it down. And the final thing is that whilst he's the Pope, he's also a bishop, and he's the Bishop of Rome, okay? So he's the head of the Vatican state, and he's the Bishop of Rome. So this means that he's got to fulfill the role of like a bishop within those sort of things. So he'd be responsible for leading what's called his diocese, by it could be like ensuring that there's the correct amount of priests in the churches, by celebrating mass on some occasions, by just fulfilling the role of the bishop. And I suppose he's got to do a good job because he's got to be a waggle for everybody else to follow. All right, so that is sort of like the role of the Pope. Now, you could be asked about like whether we should follow the teachings of the Pope, or whether we should, whether the Pope's important, that type of thing. Well, the alternative to all of this, right, is that we don't need the Pope to guide us because we've got the Bible. We can say that the Pope is still a human being, so can make a mistake, and the Pope is. I mean, you could say that the Pope is very disconnected from us and very different from what Jesus was like, because he's surrounded by sort of luxury, and Jesus wasn't. Okay, so you've got like that sort of idea that we can't connect to the Pope, so therefore we can't really hear his message. Now, one of the things I didn't mention there on when we spoke about sort of like teaching and that sort of stuff, right? I didn't mention the word infallible, and that's an important one, okay? That sometimes it's called when the Pope speaks, it can't be wrong, it's infallible. So what he does is that sometimes he will teach on certain things, or he will speak also ex cathedra, which means from the chair. It's the idea that when he speaks ex cathedra, it's such an important issue with sort of like rubber stamps, if you want, that what I'm saying here can't be wrong. And he's made two infallible statements, okay? And they're both to do with Mary, and one of them was called about the importance of the Immaculate Conception, and it is true and it happened. And the other one is about the Assumption, okay? So that Mary was raised into heaven. So that's the role of the Pope. Now, the Magisterium, okay? The Magisterium essentially is, so you've got the Pope and all the top dogs, all right, the cardinals, all right, so like important bishops, who work alongside each other to interpret the Bible and teach in the church about it. So you could be asked about sort of like the reason why they're important. Well, just think about it, right? It's quite common sort of sense, right? So first things first, they interpret the Bible to give instruction to Catholics to help them lead a good Christian life. I mean, that sort of things. You think of things like just like, do you mean how sometimes, I mean, I'm not talking about like major sort of like dilemmas here, I'll go on to that in a moment, right? But just placing God, doing the teachings of the Bible into today's society, so it gives them sort of instruction of what a good Catholic would look like. So that's the first thing, right? That they oh, here we go. Link it to the idea of the roles of men and women. So if we look to the Bible, however, and it says, wives submit to your husbands, Okay, well, that sounds incredibly sexist. Okay, but in fact, what the Magisterium have done is they've interpreted this, and they're talking about how instead of sort of like focusing on this teaching, that Catholics should focus more on how we made in perfect equality. Okay, and that men and women can have the same sort of role, and you can link that to sort of the idea of the catechism as well. All right. Then what's called the next thing they do is that they interpret the Bible to help Catholics respond to modern day dilemmas. You can talk about things like gay marriage, you can talk about IVF, that sort of stuff. And the reason for that is that sometimes it's hard to figure out the true message of the Bible ourselves, right? Because obviously there's sort of not these contradictions, but you could pick a teaching and you could apply it to any sort of scenario to justify your own means. So the Magisterium ensure that doesn't happen. They give official teachings on sort of modern dilemmas caused by science or society changing, that sort of stuff. They also make sure all church teaching is consistent, so we're all singing off the same hymn sheet. So they'll send out letters. They'll sort of give direction to like bishops, sort of thing that they work alongside in like conferences. You can say about the Pope sending letters out to the rest of the church, or over to the bishops to say, look, this is what we should be teaching. All right, so that's the major sort of role as well, is making sure the teaching is consistent. The fourth thing, all right, is they're making sure, this is quite a good one, an interesting one, is making sure that church practices fit with today's society, but are also in line with Jesus' teachings, okay? And the reason for that is that they want to make sure Jesus' voice and teachings are still heard in today's society, but at the same time, it's still got to appeal to the people in our society. How things doing, our society now is different to what it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Do you know what I mean? We need to, as you know, keep up with the times, but ensure that Jesus' message is sort of like contained within that. And you could talk about this, right? You could talk about, you could link this to the Second Vatican Council, and you could say that when the Magisterium met, and it was the Second Vatican Council, is when they altered some of the sort of the practices to allow it to appeal to today's society, as well at the same time that it protected Jesus' teachings. The final one is they make statements on key religious ideas to help Catholics understand important beliefs in their faith more easily. Okay, so the type of things that you could talk about there would be like when it comes to sort of like clarification. You could say when it comes to Mary, those two infallible statements I spoke about a second ago, that you could say that there's some things that are challenging sort of the test our faith, and the Magisterium take it or see it as their responsibility to clarify some of those challenging things and to give us guidance. All right, so to sort of go over it, that they help to clarify some challenging things within sort of the church. They make sure that today's church, the practices appeal to society, but also that they protect sort of Jesus' message, that they make sure all church teaching is consistent, they give guidance on sort of modern day dilemmas, and also they give guidance on sort of just or clarity on what it is to be a good Catholic in today's society. The reason why the Magisterium isn't important, okay, if it comes up as an evaluation question, you can say that it's made of human beings, so it could be wrong. We've got the Bible to give us sort of guidance. And also when it comes to interpretation, so like a third point, or you could link with the Bible one, is that we can interpret it for ourselves. Why do we need anybody else to do it for us? Now, the final topic for this bit is the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II. Now, put this into context, right? So essentially it's like a big meeting, this is, okay? And lots of documents were created after it in Latin, so we need to learn those words. So during the 1950s and 60s, okay, society was changing, all right? It's sort of like driven by sort of the improving rights for women, for sort of marginalized groups, and the church was sort of like at a crossroads, really. They had to ensure that the message of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, were protected, but at the same time, they had to make sure that the church still had a position in what this very sort of like quickly changing world. So what they did is that they met together to ensure that both of those things, that they could appeal to others, they could appeal to society, but also they could make sure that Jesus' message was sort of heard and still consistent to what he taught. So what you need to do in this answer, you need to say, all right, they wrote the document. So firstly, they wrote a document called this. Then you need to explain what they wanted to do with it. And then when it comes to the therefore part, you need to say, this is what I was like before, this is what I was like afterwards, okay? So the way I'm going to pronounce these is just kind of like how they're spelt, all right? So the first document is Gaudium et Spes. Now, what they wanted to do is, the whole thing of this is that they wanted to, all right, they want to think about how they interacted with other sort of beliefs and people in society, okay? So the type of thing, right, is if you think about like sort of like faith and science, okay? Scientific development during this time was big. The faith sort of like other faiths were sort of growing, or that societies becoming more mixed, so people who were Christian or Catholic were interacting with people who were Muslim or Sikh more often. So this document, Gaudium et Spes, says that we need to interact with these people a little bit more and have discussion with them. So before the Vatican Council, it was sort of like the church would reject the ideas of science and other religions, whereas after it, okay, after Vatican II, they sort of acknowledged that they would interact with these with other views, and by interacting with them, they would help to strengthen their own views, because their views were being put to the test, and that when they were challenged, being able to respond and discuss these things, then what it would mean is that your faith would pass that test and become stronger. So the next one is called Sacrosanctum Concilia, okay? Now, this is all to do with worship, okay? They wanted to change the way that we worshipped a little bit. So before, all right, the priest wouldn't face the people and everything would be said in Latin, whereas afterwards, all right, it was said in the language of the country, and that the priest would face the congregation, would face the people, so it was more inclusive. That one's quite easy, isn't it? The next one is De Verbum, okay? Now, this one is that they just wanted to stress now the real importance of the Bible and that Catholics should study it. So beforehand, all right, the church would sort of, well, whilst they wouldn't say you should ignore the Bible, however, but they would say that the most important thing probably was listen to it in Mass, whereas after, they were saying that Catholics should go and study the Bible, and sort of Bible study classes became more common in Catholic churches. The final one is Lumen Gentium, okay? Now, what they wanted to do with this one, it said, right, they wanted Catholics to accept their calling, it says here, right, to be the light of the world and spread that light to all people, okay? So essentially, Lumen Gentium is saying that Catholics need to understand that they need to evangelize more. And you can phrase it that way if you want, okay? That they believe the Catholics should step up and they need to evangelize more. So therefore, all right, before this sort of document, right, it is saying that sort of, if you want, Catholics would see this responsibility more to do with sort of the church and church leaders, that sort of stuff, whereas afterwards they had a responsibility to fulfill vocation, okay? So love, evangelize, and service in their own lives. All right, so that's quite a challenging topic, all right, but if you break each one of them down, Gaudium et Spes is to do with the fact that we should interact with other views, and that'll help to strengthen our own. Then you got Sacrosanctum Concilia, that one's all to do with like changing how we sort of worship, the language, priests sort of turning around, that sort of stuff. De Verbum, and this one is how important the Bible is. Before we didn't study it as much, now study Bible study classes coming around. And the Lumen Gentium one is essentially getting God's light to everyone. Jesus is light to everyone. So it sort of like encourages Catholics to go and evangelize more. So beforehand, this was seen as more of a responsibility of the church and priests and that sort of stuff. Whereas after Vatican II, it was seen really as a responsibility for all Catholics, and they were encouraged to go and evangelize. Thanks for watching.